Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us again at the third annual Judicial Summit on Mental Health. This afternoon, we will have 3 panels of experts discussing questions that come up as we follow an individual, Joe Smith, across the Intercept models. Our hypothetical individual, Mr. Smith, is a 25-year-old adult male who has IDD. For a broader discussion, we will sometimes assume that Mr. Smith has the developmental disability of autism. At other times, we will alter the facts to assume he also has an intellectual disability. We will talk about the difference this makes in our system as we will follow Joe throughout the various opportunities where he could be intercepted to prevent or reduce his interaction with the criminal justice system. First, I would like to introduce each of our panelists, and I'm going to give them the opportunity to say hello, tell you what role they will be stepping in today for our afternoon hypothetical with Joe Smith. First, I will start with Ms. Clair Benitez. Claire has worked with the state-supported living centers for over 10 years. She started her state-supported living center journey as a direct care professional and continued work within the behavioral and psychiatric departments. Her vision towards process and service improvement led to leadership roles in case management, special projects, and center administration. Currently, she serves as a continuity of care coordinator, managing a team of staff that are dedicated towards access to services through admission and integration back into their communities. Claire?
Hi, like Kaylee said, I'm the continuity of care coordinator at the state-supported living centers. So a quick thing to remember, I would do anything with admissions, transfers, or transitions, especially linking people from the community to services that the SSLC has, and linking people back into their community as they transition from the SSLCs. Thanks, Haley.
Great. Next, I would like to introduce Judge Nelda Cacciotti. She has been a judicial staff counsel for the Tarrant County Criminal Courts since May 2015. She was appointed as the mental health magistrate in July 2016 and presides over incompetency and insanity proceedings, as well as other mental health related matters for the Tarrant County Criminal Courts. She also serves on the JCMH Collaborative Council.
Hello, today I am standing in as the trial court judge.
Great, thank you. Next, I'll introduce Dr. Dawna Campbell. Dr. Campbell is a licensed psychologist currently employed with the Health and Human Services Agency at the Mexia State Supported Living Center. Dr. Campbell received a master's degree in clinical psychology from Sam Houston State University and a doctorate degree in psychology from Walden University. She is a member of the Psych Honor Society and the Texas Psychological Association. Dr. Campbell was previously employed at the Texas Juvenile Justice Department and has over 15 years of experience in working with individuals who have mental health issues and or intellectual disabilities who are also involved in the criminal justice system. Dr. Campbell?
Hello. Today I'll be representing the psychologist who would be assessing Joe before he goes to court. And then also I would talk about what would happen if he came to an SSLC for competency restoration.
Great, thank you. Next, I'll introduce Beth Mitchell. Beth received her undergraduate degree from the University of Florida and her law degree from the University of Miami School of Law in 1991. Since that time, Ms. Mitchell has been employed with Disability Rights Texas, the nonprofit federally authorized protection and advocacy agency for Texas that protects and advocates on behalf of persons with disabilities. For the past decade, Beth has managed and supervised Disability Rights' institutional rights and civil liberties issue team focused on individuals with mental illness and intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Hi, thanks, Haley. I will be Joe's attorney.
All right. Next, we will introduce Judge Kirk Noaker. He is a 30-year veteran of law enforcement and criminal defense, serving in a number of roles over the course of his career. In 2016, he was appointed as an associate municipal judge to the cities of Burnet and Bertrand, Texas. Shortly thereafter, he was appointed as the criminal magistrate judge by the Burnet County Commissioner's Court. Judge Noaker is a faculty member of the Texas Municipal Courts Education Center and teaches for the Texas Justice Court Training Center.
Thank you, Haley. As most of us know, unfortunately and regrettably, and sometimes perhaps even improperly, people that may be in a position of being in mental health need or a crisis and IDD, well, they get arrested. And sometimes that's because maybe law enforcement don't feel that there's other options. But when they're arrested, they go to the jail and they see somebody like me. Therefore, I will be playing the criminal magistrate.
Great. Next is Dr. John Price. Dr. Price is a psychologist with the San Antonio Police Department. He has been in private practice, a staff psychologist and program director for a pain management program, and was on active duty with the United States Army as a division psychologist. He is a TCOLE certified instructor and has taught in hostage negotiation school since 1989. Dr. Price earned a doctorate degree in counseling psychology from Texas A&M University, a Master of Art in Clinical Psychology from Trinity University, and a Bachelor of Art degree in Psychology from Texas Tech. Is Dr. Price with us? I know we're having a little difficulty getting him joined.
We are still having a little bit of difficulty.
Okay, when Dr. Price will serve as a police department psychologist in our panel this afternoon. Next is Dr. Maria Quintero-Conch. She is a licensed psychologist with 40 years of experience in developmental disabilities. In Utah and subsequently in Texas at Beaumont State Center and MHMRA of Harris County, she applied her knowledge of mental health and developmental disabilities to the development of programs for persons with intellectual disabilities, autism, and severe behavior problems. She is currently employed at Tri-County Behavioral Healthcare in Conroe, Texas. She serves as the IDD Authority Services Psychologist.
My role as yet another psychologist who's in Joe's life is to be the psychologist that will determine his eligibility for services at his local community center.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Melissa McRoy-Shearer. She leads the Travis County Mental Health Public Defender, which she joined at its inception in 2007. The office represents individuals facing criminal prosecution while experiencing poverty, serious mental health, neurocognitive, intellectual, and developmental disabilities. In this role, she participates on various boards and committees whose systems and services impact this population. She is a frequent consultant and presenter on best practices for zealous advocacy and support of individuals with multiple disabilities.
Hi, today I'm playing the role of Joe Smith's mother, and I also have some resource roles as an attorney.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists. All right. So let's start by talking about how Joe might receive services before any justice involvement. So first, we're going to start by talking about how he is identified. Dr. Quintero-Conch, will you tell us the difference between an intellectual and developmental disability?
Sure, and we have a slide that shows a little bit about developmental disabilities. There are a number of developmental disabilities. I think one that people are most familiar with are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There are a number of learning disabilities that are identified in schools. But what we're talking about today are three areas that are subsets of those disabilities. They can occur for a number of reasons. They could be from environmental exposure, either in utero or after a child is born. They can come from genetic conditions or syndromes. Most of them, we don't really know how the condition developed. But the three areas that could get a person like Joe into services would be intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, and then another area known as a qualifying related condition. Let's look at the intellectual disability first. Intellectual disability is very clearly defined for the purposes of state services. First of all, there have to be deficits in the person's general mental abilities. And in the state of Texas, that means an IQ below 70. This is important because it is a hard cutoff. Unlike the clinical world where you can go give or take 5 points standard error of measurement of the test, The definition of IQ for the purposes of state-funded services is an IQ below 70. In other words, 69 or less. The person also has to have impairments in adaptive behavior. That's how well I can dress myself, how well I communicate my needs, how well I take care of myself in public, how I get along with others, those functions that are appropriate for the society that I'm in. And that has to be assessed through a formal test, not through informal measures. The third requirement is that these deficits need to be evident before age 18. That's the developmental period that the state of Texas defines for intellectual disability. So if Joe is a person that has intellectual disability, these three requirements have to be in place. The next area that we can provide services to in the next slide is autism spectrum disorder, or shorthand of autism. This is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it has two primary areas. One, the person has problems in that what's called social reciprocity, the back and forth. If we're having a conversation, I say something, you say something, you build on it, I build on it, and it flows. That's social reciprocity, picking up cues from other people. The person has difficulty in that area of functioning, and we see it from the time that they're young. The other area is restricted, repetitive behaviors, repeating the same motions, repeating the same words, being very inflexible with change and becoming very upset at change. You can imagine if a police officer confronts someone that has autism, that person becomes nervous and may behave in ways that seem very unusual, when in fact their need for that structure has been challenged, and they come across as pretty defiant or uncooperative. In the case of autism, IQ is not a primary consideration, but it will determine, in combination with autism, what services a person might qualify for. And we'll talk a little later about how that might be determined. Then our third area that could be considered are qualifying related conditions. And this was an interesting one. This one's not before age 18. This is before age 22. The person developed a medical condition that impairs their ability to function in 6 primary areas of daily living. And this is actually a federal definition, and there's a link provided where one can get more information. The issue with this, and we can get the next slide, is that because it is something that occurs before age 22, we see a lot of traumatic brain injury here, might see other conditions like cerebral palsy, seizure disorder. There is a very lengthy list of diagnoses that could qualify. And if Joe were to present with one of those, may be able to get some services depending on how much adaptive behavior need that he might have. Curiously, we have veterans that are returning that have been injured and may have a qualifying related condition like a traumatic brain injury that occurred before age 22. Even that person might be eligible for some services.
Thank you very much. Now we'll move over to Melissa. As the mother of Joe, what were some of the indicators that he might have a disability?
So it started really early with Joe, actually back as a toddler, when he was in preschool. When he would get really frustrated with other kids in the class, then he would bite and hit and scream and be unable to be redirected. And it was, I know that lots of toddlers bite, but it was a much more frequent occurrence and was a lot more difficult to redirect. Also, in preschool, he really just wasn't doing well like the other kids. They would have a sticker chart for like good behavior. And at the end of the day, I would pick him up and he didn't have any stickers. And sometimes when he did have a good day, then the preschool teacher would be like, well, he actually had a good day today. So it wasn't the norm for him to have a day without meltdowns, tantrums, frustrations, particularly when they were substitute teachers, or changes in the schedule or a field trip. And so initially he was diagnosed with ADHD at age 5 and started on Ritalin. Then over time, other things started to be developmentally different from the other kids as well, like his anxiety, and lots of rigid behaviors, lots of rigid choices about what he was going to wear, and rigid speech patterns, and just a really rigid adherence to rules that he was not able to move past.
Thank you. Dr. Quintero-Conk, why do you think identification of intellectual and developmental disabilities in people is difficult?
Well, I think that just as we're talking with Joe, there are many times that a condition isn't really recognized early on. Sometimes parents are even told when they have that funny feeling that something's not quite right with my son or daughter, they may be told, don't worry about it. You're being overprotective, kids will outgrow it. But in fact, we needed to have attended to it and seen what is it that parent is seeing that is different from what is typical about development. We also live in a society where disability is generally stigmatized, and people with disabilities learn to cover up much as they can and minimize their condition or even avoid looking for help because, again, the stigma involved with that. We also can't dismiss the cultural disparities that we have documented so many times in general health. Those occur in this area as well. And it begins pretty early. There are multiple studies that have been published on students, on children that are African American children or Hispanic, Latinx children who receive disciplinary actions, school suspensions at a higher incidence, a higher rate than their other counterparts. And curiously, those kiddos are not referred for assessment, whereas children that are not in those groups are referred for assessment. So there is already from the very beginning a difference in how we're identifying kids. And this has been documented as early as in preschool. I think we all need to be more alert to the possibility that a child's misbehavior may in fact be indicative of some difficulties in development, and at least assess it to rule it out.
As a follow-up, why would early diagnosis be so important for Joe?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. There are clinical reasons and then the practical reason. Clinically, the sooner that we can intervene with a condition, generally, the better the prognosis is, the better the outcome for that person as they grow, because the learning starts that much earlier. The family is also in a better place because we can work with the family, and the family can become adjusted to and reach out for resources. Then the practical, the sooner you get to services, the better. And once those services are identified, they can evolve and they can morph as the person gets older. Also, and I think we heard this morning from one other speaker, we need to identify the condition, particularly intellectual disability, before age 19, or before age 18. It's important that we do that. It's heartbreaking when I have an adult for whom there is no one to give me a history, and even if their IQ is testing low now in the 40s, age 40, I can't render that diagnosis that could give them supports because I don't have that background. So the earlier that we can get to that person and identify, the more we can help and the more we can facilitate access to services.
Great. And Melissa, we'll come back to you and talk a little bit about communication with Joe. So what are the best communication practices that you would suggest for speaking with an individual with an intellectual or developmental disability?
One of the main ones I would say is to give them time to process. We're usually used to people responding to a question or responding to a directive very quickly, and right after we have said right after we've asked them. Say if we ask them, where do you live? We're used to someone responding quickly, and we need to not interpret someone with an intellectual or developmental disability, not interpret their slowness to response as being rude or disrespectful, or that they are not going to respond. A general rule of thumb is to wait about 7 seconds after you finished your statement before you kind of start to expect to hear something back. Another big thing is to expect the unexpected. Expect stimming, that could be rocking back and forth, blinking, noises, extra words. Expect those things and don't interpret them as you would with someone else who is of the same age. You also might want to be sure to expect unexpected behavior, as if you may not expect that a person would be really upset or crying over what they're crying over. So being sure to be respectful of what you're experiencing with them and don't make them feel worse about it. Another big thing is don't use metaphors, and also don't use figures of speech. And when you're using a word that has more than one meaning, like that's a green parking space, then be sure to check for understanding, because you may be saying you were at that green parking space and you mean the one where vehicles that are environmentally safe can park. But the person that you're talking to might be thinking there's no green parking space because they didn't see the color green. So be sure that when you're talking about things with more than one meaning, then be sure that you're communicating the same meaning. Say another thing is to really focus on the fact that the person that you're talking to or talking with is going to be focused on their basic needs being met, especially if they're in like a stressful situation, like a jail or something. So be sure that those needs are met before you're expecting them to talk at length about a subject that might be more stressful for them, or to listen to you for a long time. Be sure that those needs are met before you start expecting a lot out of them.
Great, thank you. Dr. Quintero-Conk, what can you tell us about implicit bias and how it manifests in interactions with people who have IDD?
Well, implicit bias is just that. It is implicit, so it's not as obvious. And it's something for all of us to reflect upon. If a person doesn't look disabled, we might not consider that their difficulties in interacting with us actually come from a disability. And Melissa gave some great examples of how that person might be viewing the world so differently, then we don't recognize where it may be coming from. And there are some things that we do that we don't even notice we're doing. For example, a person might be in a wheelchair and be assisted with a caregiver who's propelling the wheelchair. The tendency that the great majority of people have is when they talk to the individual, they'll actually address the caregiver instead of addressing the person who's in the wheelchair. We automatically diminish the ability of a person because of their presentation with a disability. So these are areas that we need to be more aware of, and it's activities like this that start opening our eyes and helping us to consider the possibility that the person really needs our respect and deserves our respect with their abilities.
Great. So now we're going to move into talking a little bit about community services. So Dr. Quintero-Conk, once it's realized that Joe needs some supports and services, what's the next step to secure those services?
Well, the main step that we would recommend is to contact the local intellectual and developmental disability authority, which is referred to as a LIDA. So I'll use that terminology. Now, the LIDA is part of a community center. The community centers, they used to be known as MHMR centers. That's the legal foundation upon both the mental health and the IDD services exist. And this is intact. Every community center has two components, the mental health component and the intellectual disabilities component. The mental health component is often well known to the court system and the correction system and to law enforcement. The IDD section may not be as well known, but the IDD section, the LIDA, is that single point of access for the publicly funded services. So Joe really would do well to be referred to the LIDA to see what kinds of services he might be eligible for. If we can look at the next slide. The LIDA is often referred to as the gatekeeper for services, but it's really not so much a gatekeeper as it is more a facilitator of services. It is part of a larger public-private community system of care under the auspices of Health and Human Services. There are 39 community centers, and it's very important to note that every single county in Texas has a center that serves it, that does the function of identifying if a person is eligible for services. So the majority of the centers serve a number of contiguous counties, but one can identify the community center by looking at the HHSC site. The community centers do not generally operate all of the group homes in their areas. Those are a network of private providers, but there is a relationship between the community centers and particularly the Medicaid private providers in an area. And let's look at a couple more slides. And one more. I mentioned HHSC. On the HHSC website, and this is the link, one can actually enter the community or a zip code and find exactly which center serves that particular area. We can move one more slide. And in here, you can see even the contact information and a link to be able to access that community center. I think that's important to know, and to know that you can find that, because that's the next step for Joe in order to identify his eligibility and what other resources might be available to him in the community.
Thank you. We'll talk just a little bit more about community services. And Dr. Quintero-Conk did a great job of talking about the local IDD or the LIDA's role in doing assessments, enrolling people into Medicaid services. They also provide a number of state-funded general revenue services, as well as some safety net services like crisis respite and crisis intervention. I also want to touch just very quickly on something that she mentioned, which were the Medicaid waivers. So people with intellectual or developmental disabilities disabilities may be eligible for about 5 different types of waivers that Texas offers. And these are funded through Medicaid, and they waive off of institutional care. And what we're going to do is we're going to provide you all, following the summit, a chart that shows each waiver, the eligibility criteria, and what services that waiver offers. In general, the waivers all offer some type of service that includes, but it's not limited to, professional therapies, day activity, behavioral services, employment, nursing, and in some cases, things like residential options. So you'll hear us talk a lot about HCS, which is the home and community-based waiver, and it has a residential option like a 3 or 4 person group home. And you'll hear us talk a lot about that because it's one of the more robust service packages that the state offers. The one other thing I wanted to mention very quickly about Medicaid waivers is that I know there's been some questions coming in about, the interest list for those waivers. The interest lists are very long, and the wait can be many years. And so I did want this audience to know that we do have what we kind of call priority populations or target groups. And those are designed to help people get into those waiver services more quickly if they are in crisis or at risk of going into an institution. So if you think someone needs waiver services urgently, you can contact your LIDA and apply for emergency access to those services. So now I'm going to move us. Dr. Quintero-Conk, is there anything else that you would like to share about services that are available through the LIDA?
Well, we could certainly mention the crisis intervention services. All of the LIDAs have a crisis intervention specialist for IDD services. And this is a relatively new, just a few years position that is in that within the centers. And that actually is the person that has been tasked with the newer function of receiving information, the TLETS information from the corrections institutions when they identify someone that may have an intellectual disability or has been served by LIDAs. I think it's important to recognize that function is a very new function for the centers. This just began on August 20th this year, that communication. And so the crisis intervention specialists are learning their role and learning how that works within the centers. This contrasts with the LMHAs who have been doing this now for years and have some great processes in place. The LIDAs don't have those processes yet. They're being developed, certainly being understood, but it's in its infancy. And the IDD services needs to identify what resources are necessary and how to ramp those up. In some cases, how to even develop them and fund them so that there is the same responsivity to people with intellectual disability as there are for folks who have the mental health issues. It is different from the LMHA. I think we can learn from the LMHA processes, but it's going to be an important partnership with law enforcement, with the corrections system, and especially with our courts as we work our way in this very new process.
Great, thank you. And to wrap up our discussion about community services in this intercept model, I want for Melissa, as Joe's mom, is there anything you would like to share about experience maybe that you've had with Joe and what things look like living in a community group home?
Okay. So there's, as with everything, there are some really great things and there's some really hard things about living in the community group homes. The positives are that he's got 24-hour supervision, assistance with any meds that he needs to take. They've got staff there that are making sure that they're following a schedule, which is really important for reducing his anxiety. They also have a lot of opportunities for socializing, and the group home actually takes them during the week to a day hab in which they do artwork and lots of different activities so that they're not sitting at the group home bored. Some of the challenges with these group homes are that there's a pretty high turnover rate for staff because the jobs don't pay very much and require a lot of resources and just effort from the staff to learn several individuals' behavioral plans, their medical needs, and try to implement those plans. And it becomes challenging. And it's also when they don't have a whole lot of staff at once. And so frequently, if one person has to go to the doctor to get a blood draw, then everyone has to go because there's not enough staff to leave someone behind to stay with the people, or leave at least 2 people behind to stay with the ones that are not getting the blood draw. So that kind of crowding into the van, going places where you don't really want to go, that kind of thing can lead to fights. And also just the high turnover is difficult because you have change, and you have change of the people that are in your living environment.
Thank you. All right. So we're going to skip now over to Clair Benitez. So Clair, let's talk a little bit about if all other interventions have failed and we tried really hard to keep someone successful in the community. It sounds like we might consider commitment to an SSLC rather than Joe intersecting with the criminal justice system. So can you give us a little overview of what a state-supported living center is?
Sure. So like you had mentioned, as we've discussed, the SSLC may be one option for services for people with IDD. It's not the only option. It shouldn't be and it should be the last option, but we'll kind of get into that more as the panel continues. So the SSLCs are state-supported living centers, are 13 intermediate care facilities that offer 24/7 residential services. So we're not a lockdown facility or jail or detention type centers. It's a campus-style environment. And what intermediate really means, we are intermediate care facilities, is our goal is typically to receive folks who have complex behavioral or medical needs and help resolve those and then integrate those folks back into their community. So sometimes as an intermediate care facility, we tend to see longer stays than other locations due to the complexity of issues. But at the end of the day, the goal is always integrating back into the community. So at the 13 state-supported living centers, we offer a range of services, essentially any medical or programmatic support and services that you would generally need as anyone living. So medical services, psychiatric services, active treatment, behavioral, dental, all things like that. The big difference in the service delivery is going to be the 2 centers that offer restoration services. And those restoration services for folks that come to us under the forensic commitments. And we'll discuss that a little bit later in another panel. So kind of on to who we serve, because this is really important in understanding kind of who comes to us and potential discussions with your LIDA or local authority. So the majority of folks that we serve are coming in from the community, and they can come in through the justice system. Approximately 80% of the folks that we currently serve are on civil commitments under the PITA or Persons with Intellectual Disability Act. Less than 10% of our total population right now are folks that are kind of coming through the 46B, 46C, or Chapter 55, which we've discussed in previous sections. So again, the vast majority and the rationale why people come to the SSLCs is because they have very complex medical and behavioral needs. And then again, very, very small, about approximately 6% or so are for forensic or justice involvement. So a lot of the vast majority, about 70% or so, are for complex behavioral needs that have been exhausted in the community, or services cannot, otherwise fit those needs. So they come to us. So generally, as far as distribution of gender, across our centers, we see about a 60-40 distribution with gender, men being about 60. In some of the forensic populations, we continue to see more males, but the distribution's a little bit wider, about 90-10. And then again, we serve adults, and we do have limited capacity for minors. Again, kind of what we had talked about previously in discussions before. And then after this, we really work with our partners in the LIDAs and the communities and other resources to divert children from the SSLCs. But we do have a limited capacity of minors that are served at the SSLCs. And generally, again, we see about 5% are minors, where 90% are adults within the current system. So just to kind of a couple things that, we wanted to hit on is how people come to an SSLC. Where the theme in our panel that we've just discussed thus far is connecting with your local authority or your LIDA. The local authority and the LMHA might be under the same roof. Sometimes they're near the same place, but really connecting to the local authority or your LIDA. They'll sit down with the individual and their support system and discuss a range of options. Again, the SSLC being one option of a many options to serve folks with ID. And then as far as the leaving an SSLC, again, I'll reiterate that we're intermediate care facilities. So you come to us, when you come to us, you receive an interdisciplinary care team. We discuss the reasons that led to your commitment to an SSLC with the intent of working on those issues, increasing skills, really preparing someone to integrate back into that community. And when that happens, we start looking at options in the community, and we link back up with our LIDAs again to kind of facilitate that community transition. And as people leave the SSLCs, they leave with treatment plans that we coordinate with our LIDAs, and we monitor them for about a year after they've left us. And there's a handoff again with the LIDAs. So just to kind of round that off, that's kind of an SSLC 101. We'll talk more about aspects of the SSLC as the panels continue.